I'll say thank you again. I always enjoy coming to Banner and being with people who I've just grown to love over the years. I can say I don't say that everywhere I go because I don't. You get the picture. But there are places that are really special that you come to. I hope I haven't worn out my welcome because you are still welcome to me, if that makes sense. And so thank you. I always enjoyed Dennis and Charlene. Don't you love your pastor and pastor wife? That's another thing I don't ask a lot of places I go. Because I'm afraid that I might be crickets. People wouldn't respond, or maybe even, oh, you know what I'm talking about. But thank you for having me. I've truly enjoyed being here, and I'm going to pray for you this year and do that every year that I'm with the church. After a year, you're on your own, but for a year, I'll be praying for Banner that you just get in on what God is doing. And if you would pray for me, I would appreciate that. And this week's been a little bit different. I've been all over the Word, I feel, and I figured why stop doing that tonight. So I'm going to invite you to open up to Exodus chapter 1. I'm going to share something that might be a little bit different for a closing revival service, but it's been on my mind today, and so I want to do what the Lord would have me to do. And to be honest with you, I'm going to read quite a bit of Scripture. So when you're there, let me know. Say amen. Now these are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. Each man in his household came with Jacob: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah; Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin; Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All those who were descendants of Jacob were 70 persons, for Joseph was in Egypt already. And Joseph died, all his brothers, and all that generation. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied and grew exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor, and they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar, in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service in which they made them serve was with rigor. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, of whom the name of one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And he said, "When you do the duties of a midwife for the Hebrew women, and see them on the birth stools, if it's a son, then you shall kill him. But if it's a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the male children alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing, and saved the male children alive?" And the midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them." Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was, because the midwives feared God, that he provided households for them. So Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, "Every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive." And a man of the house of Levi went and took as a wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, daubed it with asphalt and pitch, put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Then the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. And her maidens walked along the riverside, and when she saw the ark among the reeds, she sent her maid to get it. And when she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the baby wept. So she had compassion on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go." So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I'll give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So she called his name Moses, saying, "Because I drew him out of the water." I know that was a lot to read, but I want you to see this picture as a whole. Because one thing I've learned, I told you I've started a new writing project with Susie, and we've been looking at Old Testament stories, Old Testament characters that maybe we have a tendency to read by. And in those stories, we try to find truth that we can apply to our lives today. And this is one of those places where two individuals are mentioned in the middle of God's redemption of His people that we have the tendency of reading right by. There's so many people in the Word of God that we might refer to as heroes of faith. People that are even listed in the New Testament because of what they've done. So many familiar characters when you read about God's people. But long before there was ever a Shadrach, Meshach, or a billy goat. That's so dumb. But I just like doing it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, before they refused to bow before King Nebuchadnezzar, or before even Daniel was placed in a lion's den. Actually, many years before Peter and John stood tall before the Sanhedrin, or Paul found himself in prison for following Jesus, there was Shiphrah and Puah. Shiphrah meaning fair one or beautiful. Puah meaning lass, little girl, or splendid. I mean, look at that. Their names are really less than memorable. They're certainly not impressive. But somehow we see that they stood up to the powerful of their day. And because of the stand that they took, now their names are recorded for all generations to learn their story. They're midwives. I'm not real familiar with midwifery. I've never watched Call the Midwife. I know some people get into that sort of thing, but I've never seen or participated in a baby being born, and I never want to see or participate in a baby being born. There's nothing about that that's appealing to me. But anyhow, we know that the midwife's job, their job, was to assist in the birthing of babies. They'd make sure that the mother's health and well-being were seen to. They'd see that the babies at birth were healthy. It was an important job to make sure that everything was in place, that it would go smoothly. And it's actually, we might think, at least guys might think, that's not that great of a job. But in this day, it was an honored position. One of the reasons would be because it even came with the position, the privilege of announcing the sex of the baby. They would be the first ones that would say, "It's a boy," or "It's a girl." That's what they would do. They would be the first, and it carried with it, because of that, a lot of responsibility. And we see in their calling, in their job, they actually risk everything to do the right thing. Can I just throw this out there before we ever get into it? You do realize you never go wrong when you do what's right. They do the right thing. And because of that, we're reading about them. But before we get into that, as I've said, it's important to understand the backstory so we can see the context of what's going on. Now, you remember that Egypt was the place where Joseph ended up. Do you remember the story of Joseph? You're a Wednesday night crowd, so I don't feel like I need to really rehearse it that much. Joseph is the dreamer. He is the one that God gave big dreams. But unfortunately, it seems as though God didn't give him good sense. Because Joseph, being the baby of the family, how many of you all are babies? I am. Raise your hand proudly. I mean, the rest of the world is against us because mom and dad and mama and papa, they love us more. But anyhow, he was the baby at that time, and the father, it was his favored child. He doted over him. You know that. You know the story. And because of that, the brothers already held that against him. And now when he starts to have these dreams that seem to imply that all his brothers will bow before him, he begins to blab that to them, and they get tired of it. You do know if you have older brothers, that's not a good idea. Really, it's not. And we see the result of all that. They come to the conclusion that they want to get rid of him. They decide at first they're going to kill him, but then they decide that there's going to be another way. We see him as they throw him in a pit, was going to leave him for dead, but then we see this band of Ishmaelites going by, and they see the opportunity to make a coin. And so what do? They sell their brother into slavery. And we watch as that leads him to Potiphar's house. And you remember, there's something amazing about Joseph. I just don't get it. Seriously, I mean, wherever he found himself, whether it be in the pit, whether it be at Potiphar's house, and later in the prison, it says that God was with him, and God was happy with him. God was pleased with the life that he was living, which means that Joseph must have been a pretty good guy. I mean, he must not have been a complainer. He must not have been a grumbler, because usually that displeases God. And we see wherever, I just say that, don't you want God to be pleased with you? I do. I don't think I'd be real pleased from the pit into slavery, but even his own boss finds favor in him. He finds favor in Potiphar's eyes. And we see that because of that, he's esteemed there in the household. But unfortunately, he also finds favor in Potiphar's wife's eyes. And because he won't sleep with her, you know the story, this isn't HBO, it's in the Word of God. Because he won't sleep with her, she lies about him, and he ends up in prison. I mean, poor old Joseph. And remember, years are passing while all this is going on. When he's in prison, he meets, I'm sure, some questionable people. He meets some interesting people. He meets some people who are having dreams. You do remember that. There's some odd things going on. You remember the baker and the candlestick maker? Okay, that's another one I'll never say. Cupbearer, you know that they're having these dreams, and they begin to tell these dreams to Joseph, and Joseph's like, I know what those mean. And you begin to tell him what the meaning of the dreams were. It turns out good for one of them loses their head. And when the one is released from prison, you'll recall Joseph says, don't forget about me down here. Don't forget. But it seems he forgets, because as he's serving Pharaoh, time passes, more years go on, until finally Pharaoh begins to have some dreams. He begins to have these weird things, and then the guy goes, oh yeah, I know a guy. And so they send to him from prison. He comes up, and he begins to interpret the meaning of those dreams. Famine's coming, and he begins to go. And because of that ability that God gave him, he finds favor in Pharaoh's eyes, so much so that Andrew Lloyd Webber will say that he becomes Pharaoh's right-hand man. He prepares the people of Egypt, he prepares for this famine that will be devastating. It's coming their way, and they make preparations. Well, we watch as the story goes on, And I'm doing a bad job telling the story. Go home and read it if you need a refresher. Don't watch the cartoon. Don't cheat. Go home and read it. You guys are serious tonight. But anyhow, we see that Joseph's brothers, Jacob's sons, they're over there, and the famine's hitting them hard, and they know that they need to go to Egypt to get some rations, to get some grain, and so they make their way there, and they have no clue that the one that they're going to be groveling before, the one that they're going to be asking for aid from, is their brother. Now, Joseph knows who they are, and it's fun because he makes them squirm just a little bit, but can I just tell you, I'd have made them squirm a whole lot more. When I think about everything that had happened in Joseph's life, and I don't know for sure, Dennis, maybe you know the answer to this, but it was either 7 or 13 years from the time he was thrown in the pit to where he's standing beside Pharaoh. If it's 7, that's still a long time. If it's 13, it's even longer time. It's a good span of time. And when I would think about them being the reason that I'm experienced what I did over those years, I think I'd have made them squirm just a little bit more. I would have lowered the hammer on those guys. I really would. And before you judge me, remember that's biblical. Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. It's all in the way you emphasize it, right? Okay, that's not what it means. But I would have had more fun with them. But when all is said and done, I love this line. Joseph speaks to his brothers. He says, y'all meant this for harm, for evil. But God used it for good. How many of you have known God to take something that you felt would harm you and turn everything around? Aren't you thankful God does that? Works it together for our good, but never forget, we even see it in Joseph's life. Most importantly, for His glory. So this is how we see the children of Israel in Egypt land. That's why they get there. In other words, when they came, they weren't dragged kicking and screaming. They weren't forced with whips and chains. No, they went there. They were honored guests of Pharaoh because of the favor that Joseph had won from him. But time passes. Lives end. Time marches on. Generations come and go. And that's what we see there in verse 6. And when you begin to read verse 7 and then go into verse 8, what we need to realize between verses 7 and 8, a lot of time has passed. One would assume, because they were in Egypt land for 430 years, that hundreds of years have gone by. And now we see, with the changing of time and the changing of leadership, there's a new Pharaoh. And this is a Pharaoh somehow that either chooses not to recognize history or isn't aware of it, because somehow we read that he did not know Joseph. He didn't care about Joseph. And see, you've got to remember, when we talk about Pharaoh, Pharaoh at this point in history was the most powerful man in the world. You got to know that. He's the ruler of the one superpower of that day. He is the strongest man, the most important, actually by his people, by the Egyptians. He would be considered deity. Why? Because they believed Pharaoh was a direct descendant of the gods, a son of the gods, small g, himself. And so he's an important man. And the Israelites are continuing to grow. They're continuing to multiply. They're taking God's commands seriously. 600,000 men, Hebrew men, is what's estimated to have been there during that day. And remember, just like we mentioned last night in the story of the feeding of the 5,000, this is a gender-specific term. So it doesn't include the women, and it doesn't include the children. So the number is much greater than that.
They are a force to be reckoned with. And Pharaoh recognizes that. And out of fear, out of his insecurity, isn't it amazing? Some of the most powerful people that one would think are some of the most insecure. I believe that. And yet we see out of his insecurity, he enslaves the people who were once honored guests. Because of his fear, years of servitude are laid upon the backs of the Hebrews. They are treated as inferior. And you know what? If you are told you're something enough times, you might even begin to believe it. I'm sure they began to even doubt their words. And what's necessary for us to recognize? It should be very clear. But Pharaoh's plan was to break God's people. That's what he longed to do. He literally wanted to work them to death. That's why you read about working with rigor. Because you realize if he works them during the day with rigor, there's not going to be any rigor when the lights go down. Come on. That's why it's important. That's why those terms are there. Don't look at me like you don't know. I mean, come on. If you wear them out in the day, they're going to sleep in the night. Or at least that's what he believed. Pharaoh's plan is to eliminate God's people. And this begins a downward spiral of evil that toward God's people. Have you noticed that evil unchecked always gets worse? Not simply worse, but worse and worse. What's the old saying? Bad becomes better when worse comes along. And I know it's a lame example, but I think about television. And I'm not against it. I get bored without it. I go to places and some people don't give me one, and I wonder if they watch TV because they're not letting me. I mean, I'll pray all day when you pray all day. You guys, anyhow, you know, I think about when I was a kid. I told you I'm 49. My brother will soon be there with me. But I'm 49, and I remember growing up, early 80s, there was a television show that mom and dad, and I don't come from a holiness background. My family is actually more holy than some holiness people are, but at least they don't claim that umbrella. Anyhow, they wouldn't allow me and my brother to watch this show. It was called Three's Company. You remember that? Jack, Chrissy, and what was the other one? Janet. If I don't know, wasn't allowed to watch them, don't ask me how I know most of their names. They thought that was horrible. They did. I mean, that was just outside of the... But now, where do they show it? TV Land? Nickelodeon even? I mean, that's a very, very bad example, but it illustrates we become familiar with something and it doesn't seem as bad as it once was. This is a downward spiral of evil, and evil unchecked always gets worse and worse. It leads to compromise after compromise. It's the death spin of an individual. It's a death spin of society, and it really is the nature of sin itself. The goal of Pharaoh was to destroy, not to just work them, but to destroy God's people. That's what he longed to do. Evil always eliminates life. Think about that. Evil will always look to destroy, eliminate life. It didn't just start with Pharaoh, but that's where we are. So think about where he goes. It starts with servitude. Then it leads to infanticide over and over again. It just goes on, and it doesn't end with Pharaoh. Think about Herod. When the rumor of the Messiah being born came along, what was the command that he gave? Kill all the male children. It goes on from him to modern day Hitler. I mean, you can't overlook that. Pol Pot, Stalin, and we can look even at what's going on today, the Taliban. So-called change, and you're getting reports already of people, evil always looks to eliminate life. The list will go on and on because its purpose is to destroy. God creates, and evil wants to kill. And Pharaoh wanted to crush God's people. But don't you know, God is always the victor. Because we watch God's people flourish. Working them with rigor doesn't take the rigor. Well, never mind. They flourish. And so Pharaoh comes up with another plan. And this is where the heroines of our story enter the scene. Shiphrah and Puah, midwives. You would assume, many people believe it, and I think I would have to agree, the fact that Pharaoh spoke to them directly would imply that they're not just simply midwives, but they would be midwives of importance, or you could say head midwives, because Pharaoh's the most important man in the world. He's not going to command a low, come on. He directly communicates to them, and he gives them a command. Since they're the ones that help during childbirth, since they're the ones who ensure the mother's safety and the child's health, he says when the Hebrew women give birth, if it's a boy, kill him. And you know, in my translation, it says birth stool. And it's not a stool. It's not like a three-legged stool. Like I said, I've never given birth, but I don't think that would work too well. I crack myself up and you guys don't enjoy it. But anyhow, it's really stones that they would put their legs upon, where all that kind of thing. That's called the... And so it would be easy to bash a child's head. That's the command that he gives. It would be easy to suffocate the child for a cry to never be heard. He says, if it's a boy, kill it, but if it's a girl, let her live. So here we watch the king of Egypt, the most powerful man in the world, considered by his people a son of the God, which would imply that he is a God himself. He literally holds these two women's lives in his hand. He gives them a command that you would think must be followed. Kill these newborn male children. But Shiphrah and Puah, we read, don't fear Pharaoh as much as they fear God. And this is what's really interesting here. It's thought that Shiphrah and Puah are not Hebrew women. That's why when they describe it, they say the Hebrew women aren't like Egyptian women. It's thought that they are Egyptian themselves, and usually a midwife finds herself in that position because she can't have children of her own. It was a way that they could be meaningful in that hour. And that sounds so weird in the day of Code Pink, but I think you understand, especially if you look at the Middle East and the way women are treated from time, that these times women weren't elevated. And so if they weren't able to produce, remember it's considered shameful, but this is an honored position that gives them value, that gives them worth. They can actually aid. And so we watch that somehow, even though that They likely weren't Hebrew. Somehow they had come to know the Hebrew God. And you can only speculate how that might happen. Could they have been students of history and heard how God had moved amongst His people years before? Or maybe seen or heard the relationship between the women that they served and the God that they had, and when they gave birth, and the joy that came from life being given from the one true God. Who knows how, but somehow they came to know Him and believed Him to be the only God, and they feared Him more than they feared Pharaoh. So much so that even though he held their life in their hand, given them a direct command, they disobeyed. They let the children, the boys, live. And because of that, God honored Shiphrah and Puah. We don't get the gravity of that because we think, well, what's the big deal? I mean, all this. But see, we often look at the story of Joseph and then we jump to the story of Moses. But you realize when we read about Shiphrah and Puah, the ones who are responsible for birthing babies to the Hebrew women, they're not only birthing Hebrew children, they are birthing God's redemption plan. Their obedience, that's why we read down to Moses. Because had they followed through Pharaoh's command in killing the Hebrew boys, Moses would have likely been killed. And yet somehow we give attention to these stories, but we minimize theirs. It's the story of the redemption of God's people. And Shiphrah and Puah play a major role. You could say that it begins with them. They're actually named in the story, and because of that, we see their significance. Of course, they stood for the right. They stood up to the most powerful man in the world. They stood against evil because they feared God. They stood for those who had no voice, and because of that, their names are recorded in the story of God's people. That loses something today because we don't put that much importance on names. But we need to. To be named matters. To be named reveals the importance of the individual. It's a big deal. And because it's a big deal, to have your name blotted out was unthinkable. It was terrible. Remember what Psalm 9:5 says. He says, you, speaking of God, have rebuked the heathen. You have destroyed the wicked. You have put or blotted out their name forever and ever. Names matter. To have your name recorded is important. To have your name erased is a big deal. Why would I bring that up? Because I want you to see something. From the story of Joseph down to Moses, Pharaoh, that title, we know when you look in the book of Exodus, it's used 107 times. The title Pharaoh, talking about the king of Egypt, used 107 times. But do you understand? Not once in God's book is he named. Now, you can go back in history, secular history, you can look it up and you can determine who the Pharaoh was at this point in time, but in God's book, only the title is used. You have blotted out the name of the heathen forever and ever. You never hear his name, simply Pharaoh. In fact, between the listing of the sons of Jacob and the naming of Moses in chapter 2, verse 10, only 2 other people's names are recorded. You read about a bunch of characters, the son of this one, the wife of this one, the mother of this one, the daughter. You read all that kind of thing, but no names are recorded between Jacob and between the sons of Jacob and Moses in verse 10, except for Shiphrah and Puah. You have 28 lines of anonymity. 28 lines of vague, just blanks about people. And yet they're named. Folks, that means something. God honored them. Champions of life. Simply midwives. But God honored them. Why? Because you never go wrong when you do what's right. They disobeyed an evil command. They stood for the right. They feared God. They stood up to Pharaoh. They risked everything to do it, and God honored them. Keep saying that. Not only by having their name recorded, but we saw that it says in verse 21. Well, let's read 20 and 21. Therefore God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mighty. And so it was because the midwives feared God that He provided households for them. And I want you to understand what's being said here. Speaking of household isn't simply just a dwelling place. It's not just walls. It's not just a home. It's families of their own. Remember, it's thought that one's a midwife because they can't produce life. They don't have families. But God blessed them with households of their own because they stood in the security. Do you know there's a security when you stand in God's power? There is. They stood in the power, in the security of God. You never go wrong when you do what's right. Right in the middle of the story of the redemption of God's people. I've come here tonight to remind you that the story of the redemption of God's people goes on and on. One reason why it's important that we are familiar with the Old Testament is because that's our story. As God's people, that's our story. And just like Shiphrah and Puah, we're in the middle of the birthing story of God's redemption plan. You and I are right in the middle of God's story as well. And I know when we look at our lives, man, I look at my life and I think, what? I do. You think, what significance? That kind of things can seem so small, so insignificant. But here's the deal. You have a part to play in God's story. I don't care how old you are. I don't care how young you are. You have a part to play, and no one is insignificant. When He writes the story, we all have a major role to play. Now, we're not the main character. Of course, Jesus is. But we all have supporting roles in the divine drama. You and I are in the middle of God's story. And since we're in the middle of God's story, there are a few lessons that we can pull from Shiphrah and Puah. Choose to fear God rather than to fear man. I know that everybody in here has a different circumstance, different places of employment, different walks of life. But this is a lesson that we all need to learn. As God's people, we fear Him over fearing man. God looks at our heart. He knows those things. He realizes our intention. And when you fear people, this is why it's so dangerous. When you live in the fear of man, you will promote yourself. You will always look for ways to look good in other people's eyes. And I'm not saying, we ought to do our best. As God's people, we ought to, but here's the thing. When you live fearing God, we don't promote ourselves, we promote Him. Instead of saying, look at me, we're saying, look at the one who has made this. Our lives will point to Him, but if you fear people, it's going to point. When you choose to fear God over the fear of man, see, if you simply fear God, man, you're going to compromise. That's natural. And one thing will lead to another. But when you fear God, you will stand on His principles. You will do what He says. His priorities will be your priorities. You will live by His promises. Promises that nobody can take away from you. Rather than fearing man. But if you live to fear man, not only will you promote yourself and compromise, but you're going to self-protect. If anything threatens, you're going to self-protect. You're going to find that need. But to fear God, and by the way, that would mean not standing for something that would be unpopular. So I just want you to understand what I mean by self-protect. Got to think about my position on the school board. Got to think about my position as the President of the United States. Got to think of my position as... I can't be vocal about this. It's a shame that we're so divided over vaccines. Because we all want to protect. And you can read into that whatever you want to read. I'm just saying that's a great example. When you fear God, you'll risk everything for His glory. It won't matter the cost. You will stand for Him. Choose to fear God rather than fearing man. And since you're in the middle of God's story, since we're in the middle of God's story, it's necessary to see, it's so obvious from this text, that true heroes, not heroes in people's eyes, but real heroes honor life like God does. We watch as Shiphrah and Puah care for the least of these. They spared the lives of the helpless. And I'm just going to throw this out there because obviously, as God's people, we should hate the stain of abortion. We should stand for the unborn. But the honoring of life doesn't stop there. And that's where we think it stops. To honor life is to honor all life. Those who don't look like you, or maybe look at you. I had one guy tell me one time, I love to listen to you preach, I just can't stand to look at you. It'll bless you, they keep you humble. Those that don't act like you. Those who aren't as smart as you. We honor all life because God honors life.
That's what real heroes do. Besides, a great doctor once said, a person's a person no matter how small.
By the way, if you don't know that doctor, Dr. Seuss.
Proverbs 31:8-9. We value life. Jeremiah 1:5. We stand up for those who can't stand for themselves. Psalm 139:13-16. I just want us to see, we can't overlook this. We learn that those who fear God, real heroes, honor life like God does. And since we're in the middle of God's story, since we have a part to play, we must as well. And since we're in the middle of God's story, this one's obvious too. But sometimes it's the most obvious things that we overlook. We need to understand that blessings, true blessing, follows obedience. I meet a lot of people who pray or cry out for God's blessing in their life, but they're not willing to do what God has told them to do. Blessings follow obedience. Because they were obedient, God dealt well with them. He blessed them with households of their own. Obedience is rewarded, and the blessing may not be in the form that we think it should be. But you can never doubt that He rewards that. Faithfulness and obedience in our lives as His people must come first. If we want to live in His favor, if we want to live with His blessing, then we have to do what we know He wants us to do. Walk in all the light that we have. That's all we're responsible for. Nothing more, nothing less. We're in the middle of God's story. So is there an area in your life that you need to fear God more than you fear man? Since we're in the middle of God's story, do you need to examine or rethink your views on the value of life? The way you treat people, the stands you take. Since we're in the middle of God's story, are you living a faithful life? Are you being completely, unconditionally obedient to His will and His way for you? Schiffer and Pua did, they're named. You do know there is another book where names are written down. Let's pray that our names are never blotted from that book. Doing the right things matter. It makes a difference. I'm so thankful for Schiffer and Pua, even though I didn't know them until a few months ago. So Jesus, help us to examine ourselves in light of your word tonight. Two women that are overlooked, and yet they played such a large role in what you were doing. Help us, even though we may feel as though we're overlooked, may feel that we're insignificant, to do what we know that you would have us to do, realizing that we have a part to play in the story. Amen. Pastor Dennis.